Welcome to The F Word, a podcast series that examines, excavates, unpicks and reframes forgiveness through the lives of others. I'm Marina Cantacuzino, a journalist from London, founder of the Forgiveness Project charity, and I've built my career investigating how those who face the most complex and devastating things in life find a way through. I'll be talking fortnightly to a guest who's experienced something very difficult or traumatic in their life, but who, rather than respond with hate or bitterness, has embraced, or at the very least considered, forgiveness as a response to pain. So in this episode, my guest is Jacob Dunne. If you heard our previous F Word podcast, you'll know that I was talking to Joan Scourfield, who I actually met through Jacob. Jacob's connection to Joan is uncomfortable, it's difficult, but it's also fundamentally life-affirming because they've somehow formed a friendship, despite the fact that in 2011, in the city of Nottingham, Jacob, in a moment of mad rage, threw a punch at Joan's son, James, which left James in a coma, and 9 days later was the cause of his death. They met when Joan, with her then-husband David, took part in Restorative Justice a little after Jacob had come out of prison. Restorative Justice is a dialogue process between victim and offender. Now, when I talked to Joan, she told me about how in the end she'd been able to let go of bitterness and resentment largely through witnessing how Jacob had transformed his life. So having interviewed Joan, the obvious next F Word podcast was to talk to Jacob. So welcome, Jacob.
Thank you for having me, Marina.
I should say that Jacob is one of the Forgiveness Project storytellers, and he also shares his story and facilitates on the Forgiveness Project Restore Prison Programme. And you've done that for how many years?
3 years.
So I thought maybe we could just start with the whole thing of sharing your story. You've done it frequently. You've done it for us. You've done it for others. You've almost become a sort of a poster boy for rehabilitation.
Yeah.
But maybe talk a little bit about sharing your story and the importance of that, and is it ever a burden?
Well, up until the age of 21, I don't think I'd ever really known I had a story. I don't think I really appreciated how much the past impacts the present. And until I was contacted by Joan and David, I didn't even realise that the way I'd been living my life had affected so many people in so many ways. And having Joan have the courage to put me under the spotlight and ask me why I did what I did and how I'd become the person I'd become, for the first time made me start to look at my past and start to care about it. And so I did that, and I was filled with a lot of guilt and shame as to the impact and the harm that I'd had on others. And that was a really pivotal moment. It was like a period of enlightenment. All of a sudden I was asking myself meaningful questions like, how have I become the way I have? Where did this all go wrong? And there's a quote that we share often in the Forgiveness Project Restore program in prison, which is, I can't remember it exactly, but our greatest burden is our untold stories. And that really resonates with a lot of the men in prison and with myself.
I might have thought, and others might have thought, aren't you just going back to that time by keeping telling your story? Wouldn't it be easier not to do that, to walk away, to try and forget, and try and reform, and try and have a completely new life? But by keeping telling your story, you're sort of inextricably linked to your past. But
yeah.
Are you saying that's actually a really valuable thing?
Yeah, I think if you have to, of course, take great care when doing it, when revisiting traumatic periods in your life or just uncomfortable memories. Make sure that you have people around you, whether it's a counsellor, whether it's a therapist, or whether it's just knowing how much to delve into it. But I would say that our past definitely carries itself with us, whether we like it or not. And it manifests itself in ways that you wouldn't think possible. So with myself, when I used to block things out, I became more and more aggressive, more and more angry. And then in more recent times, I've become more and more depressed as I've channeled my anger inwards. And then this can manifest itself into like addiction and just all sorts of different traits. And so looking at it in a safe space really helps take back the pen, I guess, and start to be able to write your own narrative.
Yeah.
Because you can continue to write your own narrative for the present and the future, but without really understanding the past, you're writing the rest of your book with a faulty pen, I guess, is the best way of trying to describe it.
That makes perfect sense, and actually it really reminds me, in the early hours of this morning when I couldn't sleep and got up, and I was looking at Madeline Black's interview with Jeremy Vine. Now, Madeline Black, I think, has worked on Restore with you, and her story is about how at 14 she was gang raped and suffered appallingly on that day and for years afterwards in the way that you're describing.
Mm.
But he was really confronting her and saying, why do you want to keep telling your stories? You don't have to. Why do you want to do this? And she said this thing, and it really resonated with me, and it may with you. She said, the way in really was my way out. I had to face everything that was done to me.
Mm.
So I think similarly with you, you had to face everything that you'd done, and your way in was your way out.
Yeah, and I feel extremely grateful because my way in was provocated by the people who I'd harmed the most, which was where you least expect your opportunity to come from.
And why do you think this is? Perhaps this is a segue into talking about, the power of restorative justice, meeting someone face to face. Although I know with you had what some people describe as shuttle restorative justice, talking through mediators before you actually met.
Yeah, we had 2.5 years of speaking through letters and mediators before we felt comfortable meeting each other face to face.
Joan told me when I talked to her for the F Word podcast, she said Remedy approached you and she was hoping you'd say yes. Now, Remedy is one of the UK's leading restorative justice services, offering victims of crime the opportunity to engage in a restorative intervention, whether face-to-face or through a mediator.
It was just such a shock for me to think that David and Joan would be the ones to contact me and not necessarily want me to do well at that point, but just want to ask me the questions that they had. And
what were their main questions?
The main questions were along the lines of why I did what I did, whether I had any kind of background in combat sports or boxing or anything like that.
They already knew at that point that you hadn't set out that day to kill anyone.
Yeah.
That it was just a violent act that went terribly wrong.
Yeah, and just more along the lines of, what happened in the lead up to it. Was there some, speaking to a girl that I was speaking to, or just any other type of common reason for guys arguing on nights out. Unfortunately, we tend to get into a lot of arguments. So it was just all those kind of general questions that they had, all the different pieces to the puzzle that they needed. And maybe not all of those questions were really significant, but for them, piecing everything together was something that they really needed. Just that human contact kind of got rid of my aggression, and because I felt bad about what I did, but I didn't know how to channel that. So I just hid it behind a facade of anger and antisocial behaviour. And them contacting me kind of just subtly went underneath the facades that I had and got right to the heart of myself. And it kind of just dispelled everything, and it made it a lot more easier for me to just think, do you know what? I'm not sure if this process is going to help me, but these people clearly have questions that need answering, and the least I can do is try and help them with that, and then try and move on with my life.
And did you think when you were answering their questions to a mediator, and the mediator was taking it back to Joan and David? David is Joan's ex-husband, isn't he?
Yeah.
The father of James. And did you actually think, that's enough? I've got no desire to meet these people. Or did you always think at the end of the day, it would be really nice to meet face to face?
I always felt I would do as much as I could to help them. And if that meant meeting them face to face one day, then maybe I'll do that. And that's kind of where I was coming at it from. And I let them continue to lead the conversation.
And how did that first meeting go?
The first meeting was unbelievable. It felt like 20 minutes had passed, and when I came out I realised it was more like an hour and a half.
Were they angry? Did they show anger?
I think because we'd spoken for 2.5 years, there wasn't as much anger there, but I know that they wanted to be able to go back, be able to tell me the impact, the true impact of my crime. Talking to me about James's personality, what kind of person he was, the values he had, the friendships he had, making him a real person.
What they'd lost.
What they'd lost, yeah. What it was like for them having to sit by their son's life support machine and end a funeral and everything like that.
And hearing it from them must have been a whole different experience to hearing it through a mediator or in a written letter.
Yeah, it was very hard to hear. Usually when we're faced with uncomfortable truths, our initial responses are to kind of get out of there, run away, or try and deflect whatever's coming our way back onto whoever it is. But I wasn't in a space where I could do any of that. I'd listened for 2.5 years, and I was listening here again, doing my best to make something out of this horrific situation. But that wasn't all they wanted to do. They wanted to get that out of the way early on in the conversation, and then we moved on to what I'd been doing in terms of education, where my hopes were going forward. But by the end of the conversation, it felt like David and Joan were giving me permission to not beat myself up about it anymore, even though I still do. So that was a really nice note to leave it on.
And since then you've been doing work with Joan, haven't you?
Yeah, not so much anymore, but we speak when we can at schools or at keynote events and
about restorative justice, about the One Punch campaign.
About the One Punch campaign and just how we've managed to deal with our problems in a way that's tried not to cause further harm to anybody else.
And just to explain to listeners, the One Punch campaign is about educating people how just a single punch can actually result in more than a scratch.
Yes.
It can actually kill someone if they fall and hit their head, or if you hit it in the wrong place.
Yeah, exactly. It's so easily done, and the statistics are just increasing more and more, which is it's really sad.
Just want to go back to the whole thing of restorative justice. I mean, Shad Ali, I think he said something wonderful about it, because meeting his attacker was incredibly healing for him and helped him really move forward in his life. So I just want to introduce you to someone called Shad Ali, who when he was alive worked a lot with the Forgiveness Project. Shad had been a victim of a brutal sustained attack in Nottingham, and then years later came face to face with his offender in a restorative justice meeting in prison. Very sadly, Shad died after a short illness, but I'm really grateful to him because sometime before that he introduced me to Jacob. He was really like a mentor to Jacob and one of the key people to help him get back on his feet. Shad Ali said restorative justice introduced an element of humanity into a situation which had dehumanised both the attacker and myself. So in a way it humanises crime, doesn't it? It puts a face to the mindless thug, and also really allows victims to express their pain to the person who's caused it.
Exactly, which many victims of crime don't have the opportunity to through the normal criminal justice process. Yeah, we're making movements towards the Victims Code. The Restorative Justice has been included in the Victims Code, and there are efforts now towards supporting victims more throughout our criminal justice process and making restorative justice accessible to everybody. Because of exactly that, as you say, giving them a voice and being able to really, truly explain the impact that crime has had on them. And when you say it like that, it sounds like it should just be common sense, because for me, as well, from on the offender's point of view, you think, offenders in prison, they should know what they've done and they should be able to take responsibility and move on. But for me, when I was in prison, I think I was only ever asked by one person, have you ever thought of the parents of the man you punched? And I said, no. And I said it in a selfish way as well. I said, I thought, no, I don't want to, because those thoughts are too hard for me to deal with. So it's easier for me to block it away and try not to think about it. And on the flip side as well, as an offender who's caused harm to somebody else, how can I ever truly comprehend the harm that I've caused to someone else without them telling me themselves? So again, I was grateful that they then took that opportunity to contact me and start that process where I could then understand and I could then make the changes that I needed to make.
Joan also said to me one of the things that really surprised her, shocked her, was that when you were in prison, you told her you had felt the victim. When you explain it, and you've explained it to me before, it's perfectly understandable. But just saying it like that, there'll be people thinking, what?
Yeah.
You know, can you unpack that a bit?
I think I definitely felt like I was a victim again, because I had no idea of the harm I'd had on the people I'd harmed, and so you kind of left, I guess, to suffer with the only thing that you do understand, which is your own pain, and you just block that away and try not to acknowledge that. So it's just a very lonely place of suffering with no real way to express yourself or understand how you're feeling. And on top of that, incarceration, it's never nice. It has a massive ripple effect in terms of, I was living with my mum at the time, and because I got arrested for a violent offence, she lost her house and went homeless with my little brother. I just felt like my life had fallen apart, and
your friends abandoned you.
And my friends abandoned me. They, told the police that it was me who did it. And so I was just really confused young man with no sense of direction or purpose, and felt like I was the victim of all of this. And
how old were you again?
I was 19.
I just want to go back a little bit to what you were saying before, that Joan and David kind of gave you permission to lead your life the way you wanted to, that they wouldn't be breathing down your neck and demanding anything of you, and that how liberating in a way that was. Now, a couple of years ago, you gave an interview to a theatre director who made a play called The Listening Room, which is a brilliant concept of verbatim theatre, where she interviewed several victims, perpetrators, offenders, who had taken part in restorative justice and told their story through actors. And there was one, you were one of the interviewees at the time, and there was one line in that play which really resonated with me. I just wrote it down, and this is what you must have said, because this is what the actor spoke.
Yes.
Your character said, "I'm afraid to speak to people when I'm feeling down, because they might think, oh, this isn't the Jacob that we thought. Maybe we should be a bit more wary around him now that he's expressing feelings of anxiety or depression or feeling sad or whatever."
Yeah. I actually remember exactly where I was when I said that. And I've been in that place for about 4 years of not quite developing relationships with people who I feel comfortable being vulnerable to. So as you mentioned, Shad Ali was a Forgiveness Project storyteller, and coincidentally he was from Nottingham as well and was a victim of crime and took part in Restorative Justice. So he was a massive support for me on my journey, and someone that I felt comfortable opening up about and saying, you know what, I'm doing all these amazing things, I'm rebuilding my life, I've got my GCSEs, or whatever stage it was, or saying, I don't really feel very well at the minute, or I'm feeling depressed, or just acknowledging any hard emotions or feelings, and constantly having to put a brave face, because I was trying to market myself, I guess, as someone who was trustworthy, someone that you could employ, someone that you could give a chance to, because I felt that I'd wasted all my teenage years. I'd dropped out of school, and I was playing catch up, and I had this massive mistake that I made that was looming over me, and I didn't therefore want to acknowledge any of the negative side of things. And I applied to do social work at university because I wanted to become a social worker initially, and I was told that I couldn't be a social worker because of my offence, and I'd struggled to get access to placements, And then I tried to volunteer for my local youth offending team at one point, and they told me that I needed to do more therapy. There's a culture of people who wanted me to do well, but didn't actually want to give me an opportunity.
I guess you could say the Forgiveness Project gave Jacob an opportunity by encouraging him to share his story through our prison programme and in schools. I remember the first time I heard him speak publicly. You could hear a pin drop. He was extremely tentative, very nervous, but I absolutely know that those in the room were given an invaluable insight into understanding why damaged people can cause such damage to others. Anyway, I then went on to discuss with Jacob the whole concept of restorative narratives, stories which act as a force for good in the world by focusing on empathy and community and showing how people can mend broken hearts and repair fractured communities. I always talk about compassionate storytelling and restorative narratives because there's so many stories out there about hate, division and insularity that the Forgiveness Project chooses to focus on stories about compassion, empathy and healing and forgiveness. You know, and yours and Joan's story together is a restorative narrative. But does that ring true with you, or does it feel a bit restricted? Because I was thinking sometimes your story might feel one of anger or pain, or it might not feel very restorative.
Yeah, exactly. I think our stories are fluid and ever-changing, and at one point in the early years of me sharing my story, it was quite restricted, it was quite safe.
Do you mean that it was sort of beginning, a middle and end, change in the middle and rehabilitation at the end, and the bad thing at the beginning?
And the bad thing at the beginning, and the story that I want other people to believe, I guess, and to hear. Whereas in prison, the story I told was the story I wanted my fellow prisoners to believe and to hear. And that would be one where I highlighted the fact that I was maybe unlucky for the fact that one punch did what it did, and selling the narrative that my friend snitched on me, I knew was always going to get me instant confirmation from my fellow prisoners, and just to justify my feelings of hatred and anger. That was my safe space. That was where I felt safe. That was where I felt comfortable within my story. But I knew that wasn't sustainable, but it was sustainable in prison. So when I got out of prison, my story then changed again once I met David and Joan, and it was then about rehabilitation and changing. And that was authentic because that's what I was doing, that's where I was. But the thing to bear in mind when we're sharing our stories is that, are we sharing our stories for others, or are we sharing our stories for us? And finding that balance is important, because sometimes we're telling people what we think they want to hear, and it's quite authentic, but there's a little bit of grey area in there where you may be exaggerating a little bit, or you may be going through the motions. But what we know is that our stories change and our feelings change, and as I've become a dad, that's brought up new feelings and made me think about how would I react if that had happened to my son. Or it gives me maybe a little bit more connection, I guess. Now I've become a father with David and Joan, because now I actually know what it's like to be a parent. And so it's important not to put our narratives in nice little packaged boxes, because you don't want to beat yourself up when it changes.
Such a good point. And I've seen people come unstuck sometimes when they feel they failed because they have said something in the past like, I'm over that, or I don't feel angry about that anymore, and then something triggers, something happens, and of course it comes back again. That's real. And I think while restorative narratives do focus on recovery and mending broken hearts and about reconciliation and change and hope, the reality of it is that things change. And actually I think that is what people want to hear. I do actually think people are inspired by the truth and the reality, and people trying.
Yeah, that's what I would say my narrative is now. It's a narrative of trying my best.
Yeah, I think that's great. We haven't spoken, Jacob, about forgiveness. Where does it come into your story? I mean, I asked Joan, and I don't know if when you're together it ever comes up, but I did ask her, and she said, yes, she does forgive you now. And it wasn't something that came easily, and it was something that was very natural that came over time because she sees where you are now and she has a connection with you. Do you forgive yourself?
Some days I do think I have forgiven myself. There was a period in time where I forgived myself, but I never shared that, just because that was something that was deeply personal to me, and I didn't think other people needed to know. Because as you say, you speak something out, and then maybe you're held accountable for it later on down the line, or you then have to. Sometimes it can be a burden saying it out loud, because then maybe you have to live your way in a slightly different way going forward. And so right now, I'm not sure if I've forgiven myself, but I put caring for myself instead, I guess, as a greater priority. Making sure I take care of myself is the best way for me to eventually forgive myself.
That makes very good sense. When you talk in the Restore prison programme, are you as honest as that with the guys in there? I mean, I would have thought it was really important to be.
Yeah. It's really
maybe
important.
impossible not to be.
Yeah, exactly.
They see right through you.
They'll see right through me. And yeah, it's extremely important just to be honest. And my role in Restore, I guess, is to model the way I've approached tackling my issues. It's so hard to be vulnerable. That's perhaps the most important role of us as facilitators in that environment, is to model being vulnerable, to look at our stories and be honest.
You know, Jacob, I think that's a brilliant ending, because you have been vulnerable with me, and I'm really grateful for that. And you've talked so interestingly about, you know, the pitfalls of sharing your story. And since that is the currency that the Forgiveness Project works in, it's really important for us to learn from this and to support our storytellers and to understand the nature of continually sharing your stories, both to help others but also to help yourself.
Yeah.
And to look at that in a forensically scrupulous way, really, so that we could support our storytellers, and our storytellers can tell their stories in safe environments and be supported.
Totally agree.
So, Jacob, thanks so much for talking to us today on the F Word podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for listening to the F Word podcast. To dig a bit deeper around some of the themes we've talked about, do check out the show notes by going to theforgivenessproject.com/FWordPodcast. And from there you can also explore the Forgiveness Project website, which over the years has collected and shared many more stories of how people have transformed the darkest of situations. I also want to invite you to join the F Word Podcast Facebook group, especially if you have more to discuss or share. Again, to find the link, go to theforgivenessproject.com/FWordPodcast. And finally, all these podcasts have grown out of years of trying to shift the narrative of our time away from one of hate and division towards empathy and understanding. So if you've enjoyed this podcast, please do consider donating even just the smallest amount to help us continue our work. All details of how to do this, again, are on the show notes page of our website. But most of all, I hope you'll join me again. Next time on the F Word podcast, I'll be talking to Zach Ibrahim, a story about prejudice, extremism, and what happens when your father attempts to blow up the World Trade Center. I hope you'll join us then.